like your prints and the way they turn out? One of you. Perfect. Yeah, some yes, some no. Well, I want to first begin by saying thank you to the team that invited me to speak this evening. My name is Chris Draughon. I'm a member of the St. Augustine Camera Club, and a little over a year ago, I raised my hand to volunteer, so it was nice to see your volunteer ask that was signed up there. So I raised my hand to volunteer to help give back to the club, and when thinking about one of the topics that I could perhaps talk about, printing images and getting them to look like your vision is the topic that I came to the table with. I began my photography journey about 8 years ago. I was going through a period where it was advised that I find a creative outlet, a place to find some creativity. My day job is looking at the financial markets on a day-to-day basis, trying to make sense out of them, and share that with my clients to keep them from losing their minds. And as a result of that, most of what I do is very analytical. And so photography and being creative is that stretch, is that reach, if you will, from my point of view. And I chose photography primarily. I think I was drawn to the technology aspect of it, right? It's all of the gear, it's the editing, it's the trying to get things to work, it's all of the stuff you end up acquiring in the process. I have a problem collecting cameras. Anybody share that trait? Right? I don't know about you. You can take medicine for the gas, but I have a problem collecting things. So. And what I realized at getting into this is, while I enjoy the technical aspect of it, what I found more intriguing was the fact that while my parents had pictures of me and my sister, my wife and I didn't have very many pictures of our daughter. And kind of coming of age in the 90s, my first wife and I got married right out of high school. We had our little girl 2 years later. It was at that period in time where you're moving out of the instant cameras and into digital. And while my parents have images and pictures of me and my sister, what we have are a bunch of images on dead flip phones, right? Nothing tangible. And it was that aspect of not having that really pushed me to want to print my images, to leave a legacy to my daughter and my granddaughter now, and ultimately my grandson in a couple of weeks. So I can't wait till football, because it's another opportunity to buy another lens and get out and capture those memories. So getting into print, that's where I came into print, is I want to have a tangible aspect of my art, okay? So that's what brought me to print. And the thing that really struck me is there's a lot of expectation setting when it comes to printing. As in most things in life, if our expectations aren't set correctly, we're easily disappointed. And when it comes to printing, we need to set our expectations correctly out of the gate. So we're going to talk about that as part of getting into the right mindset. But it was learning that printing is a whole nother skill besides photography, right? It's completely separate skill set than going out, finding a composition, capturing that image, turning that image into your story, bringing it to life on a digital medium. It's a whole nother game to turn it into the print medium so that it tells the story that you're attempting to tell, right? So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to use my notes because it's been a little over a year since I gave this presentation, and a lot has gone on. I don't want to miss anything. I will say it was really cool to hear the new members in what you like to shoot, either it's people or wildlife. Last week I was in San Francisco, so I got to see quite a bit of wildlife. So housekeeping items, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to talk about as we move into this. I am agnostic to the tools that you use to create your art, right? I don't care what camera brand you shoot. No one that sees your images knows the difference. So, I have a model from about each family, right? So it doesn't matter what tool you use. And that goes for the printer too, right? There's a debate between using an Epson or a Canon printer. What we're going to talk about today doesn't matter between the two, right? I'm agnostic with respect to tools. Second, I was told I have an hour. I don't plan on taking an hour to go through this. What I want to do is go through some fundamentals of getting our mind right, getting our environment set up correctly, and then walk through a couple of examples of how we can get what's on our image to print correctly and look, and then close with an opportunity for questions. So if you have questions along the way, you can raise them, but I'm going to ask to circle back around so we can make sure we get through the content this evening. So with that, let's kind of get started here. Clicker works. So let's start with fundamentals, right? And I alluded to this a little bit a moment ago. The first thing we have to recognize is that printing is going to look different by its nature than what's on your screen, right? So prints don't automatically match what you see on your computer monitor. There are steps that you need to take to get to that point where you have an opportunity to make it look as good as possible, but we need to understand from the outset what our expectations should be, okay? First, we need to understand that what's on our screen is an emitted light, right? We've got light coming out of the projector. It's putting that light on the screen here, right? That projector is creating the visibility of this image. When we're looking at a print, we're looking at something that reflects light, okay? So when we're looking at that distinction, the reflection of that light is already going to be less powerful than the light being emitted from your monitor. Okay, so one of the things that people will complain about or struggle with is when they look at their print, they print it out and they compare it to their monitor, it looks dark, right? The reason it looks dark is probably one of two reasons. Number one, it's the reflective source, right? Your light is reflecting off of that print. It's automatically not going to be as bright as your monitor. It took me a while to get through that concept. As simple as it sounds, right? It took me a while to get through setting my expectation that if I'm not looking at that print in the correct light, it will never look like it does on my monitor. So number two is we got to make sure that we're looking at our prints under the correct lighting. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. What is correct lighting and how do we measure that? Okay. Thank you for your patience as I refer to my notes. I know that can be frustrating if you're in the crowd, but had a lot going on lately and just want to make sure I cover everything for you. Okay. We're going to talk about calibrating devices. We're going to talk about contrast ratios. This is another one that we're going to see here in a moment. Your monitor has a contrast ratio of 1,000 to 1, meaning the blackest blacks are going to be, at 0, and the brightest whites are going to be 1,000 times brighter than that. You've got a wide contrast ratio. Okay? Prints, the contrast ratio is at most 200 to 1. A lot less contrasty. So we'll talk about how to mitigate that, how to overcome that, if you will. And then we're going to talk about, again, the characteristics of the media that we're using, right? And so we can set expectations about how that piece of paper is going to project that or reflect that image to your eyes. Okay. So let's start with a review of getting your printer organized and getting your printer set up, okay? When we print, we need to understand that despite all of the work you've done creating your image on screen, what matters, what the truth is what comes out of the printer, okay? So we need to make sure that that print is our truth, okay? That's what we're trying to get to, is that print is going to have its own characteristics, and if that is the final output, that is what we're solving for. And so we need to understand, what can that printer do, right? How much truth can it tell us, right? There's a whole lot of truth being spread today, right? What's our printer spreading? So we need to know, I'm being facetious, by the way. I'm trying to read the room on some of this stuff. So I know you're all anxiously awaiting today's news. That's why I do photography, to get away from today's news. So when we set up a printer, and by the way, this can apply to if you're sending prints out to get printed on your behalf. When you're setting up to get your print right, we need to understand what it can do. And so if you have a printer, if you're considering buying a printer, or even if you're sending things out to get printed, one of the things that you want to do is create a couple of test prints to understand what your printer is capable of. This image that I have on screen here is an example of a test print. This is a TIFF image, right? So it's in a file format that is very robust. It's adopted to the correct color space, the Adobe RGB color space that you should be using when you're editing images. And when you open up your printer, you get that all set up, it's connected to your computer, or if you go home this evening and you've already got a printer set up, pull this image up and I can send a copy of it to you. You can search on the internet. It's a free public domain image. And just pull this up in Lightroom or in Photoshop and hit print. Don't do anything else other than hit print. Now, you need to make sure your printer's got the right paper setting and that kind of stuff, but don't go in and try and edit the image. Don't apply any kind of adjustments to it. Just print and see what your printer can produce. Okay? That's the truth. That's what we're solving for. Is we want to know, when it prints from your printer, how do the skin tones look? Right? How does the gradation look? Okay? How saturated are the reds in the strawberries? Right? Do these color swatches here match? How close do they match what's on your screen? Okay? You're going to see some differences. The reds probably will not be as saturated out of the gate as what you see on your computer monitor in front of you. You may find in the oranges and the blues up here on the top of the image that they're a little different color. You may find that this red here in this color swatch is going to be a little more pale than what's on your screen. And the reason why is this file actually contains colors that your printer can't print. Okay? Your printer can't print everything. Your printer has a limited bandwidth of the colors that it can reproduce. So you're going to notice differences, and it's helpful to understand what those differences are out of the gate so you can set your expectations correctly. Okay. How many color swatches can you see up there? How many unique color swatches can you see on there? 5, yeah. I think there's 12. Yeah, there's 12. This is another test image that you're going to want to produce with your printer or wherever you get your prints made, right? If you're sending them off to Bay Photo or one of the print labs and you have a preferred paper, upload this file, send it to them, hit print, and have it come back to you. What you're looking for here when the print is in your hands is how many color swatches can you see? This image is a representation of your darks, right? So you've got 0 on the left, 255 on the right, right on that tonality, right? 0 being pure black, 255 being pure white. What we're looking to do is see how precise can your printer be at separating the darks from one another, right? Because when you take an image, when you go out and capture a scene, you may be in a scene where you've got quite a bit of darks. And are they really dark? Are they pure black? Or is there some gradation there that's worth developing, worth demonstrating? So when you print this, Your paper choice will have an effect on this too. You may not be able to see anything between 0 and 4. You may not be able to see anything between 0 and 8. 8 might be the darkest dark that you can technically see being differentiated on that print. That's the black point of your printer and paper combination. Your printer is going to, it can't separate 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 like your monitor can. With a contrast ratio of, at best, 200 to 1, compared to a monitor with a contrast ratio of 1,000 to 1, or one of the MacBook screens with 1,000,000 to 1, your paper can't handle that. So you need to understand that your darks may not be as dark when they're printed as they are on your screen. Now we can solve for that. We can help keep things in perspective, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. Okay, again, I have copies of these files, and I can maybe share them with the club so that the club can share them with you. Again, they're available on the internet. You can search for them. I find them very useful if I'm trying to learn the characteristics of a certain paper type. Okay? Just create that print, put it on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and now you know what that printer and paper combination can produce. Okay? And you're going to use that later when it comes to editing your image for print. Right? It comes to editing the image for print. Okay. So a little bit about color space. Anyone familiar with color space? Right. You know what color space is to a degree? You may have heard, maybe some people have different understandings, more technical understandings, but for those that aren't too clear on it, a color space is a set or range of colors and tonalities and brightness levels, contrast, saturation, that we can work in as artists. The Adobe RGB is a color space. Adobe ProPhoto RGB is a color space. sRGB is a color space. And if you're on an Apple device, a Display P3 is a color space. All of those are color spaces, and you may have heard of those names of color spaces before. I mentioned this to highlight that when we're working with an image, right, our cameras, they capture in Adobe RGB, for example. Right? They can also capture in sRGB if that's your preference, but Adobe RGB has many opportunities to collect colors. It's a very large color space. Compared to something like sRGB, you'll have a lot less colors. And you may not realize it because our eyes have a way of tricking us, but when you sit them side by side, you want to be working in the color space that has the most opportunity to get the colors that you saw in nature. Right? You don't want to limit that. Your printer, however, isn't Adobe RGB, and your paper isn't Adobe RGB. And so what I have here on the left is a representation, a 3D model, of how large the Adobe RGB color space is. This is what Lightroom uses, this is what Photoshop uses, this is what DxO uses. Adobe RGB was created specifically for printers and people that print, right? It was created to capture the majority of colors that at the time printers and paper combinations could produce. That doesn't mean that that device is going to create all of those colors. In fact, on the right, what we have the Adobe RGB color space in white, and we have the color space of a certain brand of paper and my personal Canon Pro 1000 printer. And what we'll notice here is that The color space of my paper and printer combination is a lot smaller than Adobe RGB, which means by default, if we don't do anything, the image is not going to look like what's on your screen when it comes off your printer. Right? They're in different spaces. The printer may not be able to reproduce all of the colors in your image. Right? If you have sunsets, generally those reds are going to be very hard to to really pull out. So this is an understanding that we have to set. That one of the reasons why our prints don't look like what's on our screen is because of the media, and the media has a color space that's much lower than what we're working with when we're editing our images. Okay. When it comes to paper choice, again, every paper and printer combination has its own unique color space. Some paper will allow you to see more of those black tones that I showed you a moment ago. For example, the paper choice that I use paper from a company called Moab. You may have heard of them. There's also Hahnemühle and Canson and Canon and Epson all have paper. The paper I use for the majority of my prints is one that will really show that gradation between the low end of the darks. Okay? I'll use a photo paper that is a little bit of semi-gloss to it. It's not matte for most of my prints. It's a photo paper, not a matte paper. And the particular paper I use has a very wide gamut compared to other paper, because I want to be able to see those details in the shadows. Most of my photography is landscape, and so it's at sunrise or sunset. So I'm out there, and I've always got darks in most of my scenes. So when you start out printing or you print, I would encourage you to pick one or two papers that you like and become very familiar with the characteristics of that paper. You could have one photo paper for your very detailed, high contrast type of scenes, and you may have a matte paper if you're doing something more artistic, more fine art-ish, and you want to have a more of a matte look. A matte paper is going to have a lower dynamic range, a lower contrast ratio than a photo paper. Again, a photo paper, that contrast ratio, 200 to 1. A matte paper, 100 to 1. Right? Very small, very narrow contrast in a matte paper. So pick one or two and become very familiar with it. There are a lot of paper options out there. Some that are very smooth, some that are very textured, some that are made out of bamboo and very expensive from Japan, some that are very generic in their nature. And don't use copy paper because it has no dynamic range on it. Pick one or two papers and learn, right? Learn what that looks like. Okay. So let's talk about the workspace, right? The workspace that you should be using if you're trying to create images for print. Your workspace consists of where you operate, right? The environment that you're editing in. It consists of how you have your monitor set up. Talk about that and some things you can do to your monitor to make it look more like the print, instead of making your print look more like your monitor. And then we'll talk about some editing software. What do I do when editing images and what programs I use and why I use them. Again, if you have questions, let me know and we'll circle back around to them here at the end. Okay, so let's talk about the environment. When I'm editing images, I'm generally in a room darker than the one we're in right now. I don't have any lights on except for the monitor and a light on the back of the monitor to give me a little less eye strain. When we're editing images, we need to remember that the monitor only needs to be a little brighter than the environment that you're in, than the ambient environment that you're in. And one of the challenges that people will have when they're comparing the print to what they see on their screen is they edited the image in a well-lit room. And as a result, their monitor is cranked up with its brightness levels. And so out of the gate, you're already shooting yourself in the foot. Right? You're operating in an environment that's setting up an unreasonable expectation. We need to be in an environment where we don't have distractions. So I'll turn the lights down, except for the light behind my monitor. And again, that's just a little LED strip that's using daylight balanced LEDs, right? So they're set to 5,500 Kelvin, right? I want to make it look like daylight behind my monitor. I don't want any color casts. I don't want any bright areas off into my peripheral vision. I don't normally edit during the day because I have a full-time job. But if on the weekends, right, if I open my blinds are right over here, it's very distracting. You can't edit because you just constantly got this bright light in you. So the studio that you're working in, the office that you're working in, the area that you're working in needs to be low. The ambient lighting needs to be low, and your monitor only needs to be slightly brighter than that in order to be effective. What I have found is that the brightness level on my monitor is generally around 30% of its power, 30% of its capacity. Very dim, if you will. Okay. If you're using a laptop, again, if you're using a MacBook, and I assume other relatively new laptops, the monitors on those can be very bright. They can be very contrasty. And if you're editing in a room that's well lit and the monitor on that laptop is turned up, you're shooting yourself in the foot. We need to get into an environment where we can have some shade, if you will. So I alluded to this a moment ago when we began, that one of the things that most people struggle with and don't realize it when they're going through it is they're looking at their print in an environment that isn't fair to the print. So, for example, if we turn the lights on in this room like they were originally, and we bring a print in and we're looking at that print, and maybe you've experienced this if you've had prints on display here, the print is going to appear dull, even with the lights that were on before. They're going to appear dull. They're not going to have any saturation. They're going to appear gray in many respects. And that's because even though the light might be bright to you, it's not bright enough to reflect off that paper in a way that really honors that paper. Okay? This is why if you'll put prints on display at a gallery, they'll always have the LED light that's daylight balanced, shining on that print. If you get suckered into buying art on a cruise ship, and you bring that home and you want it to look like it did on that cruise ship, right? You need to put the right light on it to see the paint pigments come out of that. And so you need to have the right viewing conditions to judge, does that print look good? So while I'm editing, this light is turned off, but when I'm viewing it, I'll turn that light on, I'll let it warm up, I'll hold the print up underneath it, and look at how that looks, and I'll be going back and forth. This light is to the left of my computer that I'm editing from. This is a simple Amazon Basics $20 task lamp with a $90 bulb in it. Okay? The bulb is a high quality, a very highly rated, daylight balanced light bulb from a company called Waveform Lighting. You can Google them. They specialize in very accurate light representation. So 5,500 Kelvin, put the bulb in, let it warm up. There are other options on the market for viewing lights. Familiar with the company Calibrite? They used to be called X-Rite, right? They have a task lamp, for $150 that you can use. You may have heard of a company called GTI. They make viewing booths, right? So if you have a problem with gas and you're looking for something else to buy, you can buy a $1,000 viewing booth that you can mount your print to and have a right light underneath that. Although you can find tabletop viewing booths on eBay, sometimes on clearance. And it does make a difference, but you don't have to do it. You can do this with a $20 task lamp and a high-quality light bulb from Amazon. Last year, I attended a printing workshop in Maryland with a couple of guys that run a print studio. And in their studio, they've got two, 6-foot wide viewing booths. And if you ever want to see what a print should look like, you put it in the right environment. And generally, you'll be impressed with it. But having one of these makes all the difference, because without the right lighting, you're not going to be able to make a fair assessment of what that print looks like. And if our expectations are such that I'm going to print this, hold it up under this light, and make a judgment call, it's not going to work. And I went down this rabbit hole in the year that it took me to really understand it. I went and bought light bulbs and put them in the ceiling, where the ceiling lights are, and I'm standing there in the office, and they're telling me to go outside and look under the sun and all this nonsense. No, just get you a $20 task light and a light bulb and hold it up. So when you're making that print it on a letter-sized piece of paper so that you can actually handle it over here. You can see what that looks like. If you need to make adjustments to it, you can make those adjustments before you print a big image. Okay, so let's talk about monitor calibration. Who calibrates their monitor? Okay, so about half of you calibrate your monitor. Let me spend a few minutes on monitor calibration. So we went through and talked about printer calibration, which was simply turning it on, running a test print through it, seeing how that results back. That's generally what a printer calibration can look like. It can get a little more technical, but it doesn't have to. A monitor calibration is important if you're, I don't want to say serious, because you can be serious about your art, but if you're concerned that the colors aren't being represented correctly on your monitor, you can calibrate your monitor periodically to make sure that it's actually presenting colors in the way that they're intended to be. Over time, your monitor may drift, and it may be very subtle, and it may happen over a 6-month period, and you may print an image today and then come back a year later, print the same image, and you compare it to your monitor and it doesn't look the same anymore. The reason why is because your printer has deviated from its original specs. So calibrating your monitor can be done in a couple of ways. I mentioned this company called Calibrite. They make a device. You can set it on the monitor and it'll run that calibration for you. Just do that periodically, once every couple of months, and it'll just make sure that the monitor is producing the colors that it should be. Some new monitors, if you're in the market for a enthusiast grade, professional grade monitor to make sure you have accurate color representation, will actually do the calibration for you in an automated way. Right? So a company called ASUS, they have a ProArt series of monitors. Those monitors now come with a little pop-up calibration device, and you can set it to run automatically, periodically, and make sure that the colors are always accurate. When you're setting the calibration, in addition to making sure that the colors are being accurately reflected, one of the other key components is making sure that that brightness is appropriate. Right? So how bright is too bright? Well, generally, again, 30% power is a good back-of-the-napkin way to approach it, but when you're calibrating it, what has been found to be kind of an industry standard or normal expectation is to have this measure, which is, to set it at a measure between 80 and 120, and we'll get to that here in a second. Your monitor can be very bright. Right? It can be very bright. We need to make sure it's dim. So in the calibration device knows what the appropriate brightness level will be, and as part of that process, it'll tell you, hey, you need to turn your brightness level down until it hits that target. It'll give you a little bullseye, if you will, and then if it's too low, it'll tell you to turn it up. It'll get you to set that color brightness correctly. Some of the other pieces that you may be able to do if you're using certain monitors Again, the more enthusiast grade monitors will allow you to create profiles, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. But they will allow you to set the color temperature of the monitor, right? They'll allow you to change the contrast ratio of your monitor. And that could be helpful. Those could be helpful to get your monitor to look more like your print. You know, to get you, 90% there by just getting your monitor set correctly, so you know what you should expect. I use a monitor from a company called BenQ. Anybody familiar with BenQ monitors, right? They've become pretty popular over time. They allow you to create these profiles so you can set the color temperature. So we have here this white point, D65. Well, what is that? Most monitors are set to be rather cool in their presentation, right? Their color cast might be a little blue, if you will, subtly blue. D65 is just a way of quantifying that. But your prints, they may need to be a little warmer than what's on your monitor. So it would be nice if you could set the white point of your monitor to be more like daylight, like D50, for example. We can set the color space that the monitor is working in. So again, we want the monitor to be in Adobe RGB, if that's what we're editing in. We don't want the monitor to be in sRGB, a much smaller color space, if we're editing in Adobe RGB, because it's not going to show us what we want. And then we can set the black point. So again, the black point is saying, do I want the contrast ratio to be full game, or do I want to dial down the contrast ratio of my monitor to be a little more like the contrast ratio of my print? Right? If you're using a MacBook Pro, if you're using a newer PC that has LEDs and a very crisp and very saturated and a very contrasty screen, if you're going to compare your print to that, the screen is always going to look better. It's always going to look better because it has the capability through that emitted light and that wide contrast ratio to make things pop. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, so, yes. And so it doesn't have to be an expensive monitor, first off. Right? So the monitor that I use was just a few, and I don't want this to sound flip, but it was like $400 or $600. Some people may call it expensive, but it's not the $3,000 or the $6,000 Mac monitor, if you will. So it doesn't have to be expensive. You want to make sure that the monitor has the capability to do a high level of Adobe RGB. That's probably the most critical piece. Okay? If you have a standard MacBook, okay, the nice thing about MacBooks is they're highly calibrated from the factory. So they don't really need a whole lot of what I'm talking about right here. So if you have one of the studio displays from Apple, not the $6,000 display, but the one below that where the average people, normal people can use, they come pretty well defined and don't require a lot of manipulation. So what I'm covering here is kind of setting Apple to the side. If you're using a non-Apple device and you have a monitor connected to it, whether it's a laptop or whether it's a Dell monitor or Asus or whatnot, many of those can be calibrated using the Calibrite device. And what the Calibrite device is, it's going through and it's creating this, I don't want to get too technical, but this profile that will interject whenever you open your editing software. It'll kind of step on top of the monitor to make sure the monitor is correct. Okay. So there are ways to do this. I'm just kind of giving you the benefits of how can we make things more in our favor if we're really interested in this. The key is you want to be in Adobe RGB, right? You don't want to have a $60 monitor that's only sRGB, right? If you're serious about the prints. Okay. A word about where the technology's at, right? So if you're interested in upgrading your monitor to something like this, the prices are coming down and the capabilities are going up. So I use a monitor from a company called BenQ. I referred to a company called Asus a moment ago. They have a ProArt series line of monitors, right? They run the gamut in terms of price points, and that ProArt series allows you to do this in the monitor, right? For a very reasonable cost. So my point there is that accessibility is being improved as the technology evolves. Part of that technology is because of something I really won't get into, but you may have seen some of the new HDR stuff that Adobe and Apple are responsible for, where pure white is technically a lot more pure white than you may have thought. So, okay. Okay. So once we've got our environment set up, we need to then move into the editing world, okay? And there, what we're going to do is once you get to a place where the image looks on screen like your vision leads you to develop, we need to take a master copy of that image and move it over into the world for editing for print. And this is where we're going to use a thing called soft proofing. Are you familiar with soft proofing? Okay. Soft proofing is where we can use the monitor to give us a very good representation of what that print's going to look like, because we're telling the monitor, the paper, and the printer that we're using to print on, we're going to simulate what the color in the paper is going to look like. It gives us the ability to have a very close representation of what that print's going to look like when it's printed, but doing it while it's on screen. So while we're in the soft proof mode, we can edit the image to look like the digital image that we were happy with. And initially, when you move into soft proof mode, what you're going to notice is that the image doesn't look very good at all. Right? It's actually going to look terrible. We're going to make it look good because we're working with the characteristics of the printer. Okay, so let's talk about some of the things here. I got ahead of myself a little bit. Pardon me. You'll notice up here on screen I have this box. So this will give you a good chance to talk about what software I use to edit for print. How many Lightroom users are there? This is the majority of people. Photoshop, are you comfortable with Photoshop? Okay, perfect. I use those two primarily. Lightroom has a dedicated print module in it, which can be good, but is a little more challenging in my experience to produce the results that you're going after. Lightroom can make things easier than Photoshop, but in exchange for making things easier, it takes control of things. It gives you less control than you may want. So what I generally find is I will do, when I'm editing an image, I'll bring it into Lightroom, I'll do most of my core general editing in the develop module, and then I'll pull it over in the Photoshop to do a few more finishing items. And then when I'm ready to print, I'm going to pull that image into Photoshop for a couple of reasons. First, Photoshop will allow me to use layers and blend modes to edit globally and locally in a way that Lightroom can't yet do that. Okay? Familiar with blend modes? Let me say this. Anyone not familiar with blend modes? Okay. So what a blend mode does is when, if you're in Lightroom and you're familiar with the masking section that is relatively new, right, and you're creating a mask, if you're trying to enhance the color or the brightness, you may only want to enhance the brightness and not the color. Well, Lightroom doesn't really let you do that. Whatever you adjust, it's going to affect all of that. Like Photoshop, when using their masking and their layering, you can actually select the blend mode to only adjust the brightness or only adjust the saturation. Okay? And Photoshop's masking is still superior to the masks that Lightroom creates. And I'll show you some examples of that here in a moment. So I use Photoshop to soft-proof. Even though there's a dedicated module in Lightroom, that module can work great. Once you've created the soft-proof version of your file and you want to print it, you can print it from Lightroom. But getting it set and getting it edited for print, I do that in Photoshop. I'm going to show you how easy that can be here in a moment. Okay. So you edit your image like you want it to see on digital. Right? You edit your image for the way you're going to display it on the internet or on your social media. You edit your image for the way you're going to see it on your iPhone. You do that first. You then create that master file. When you're ready to edit, use file versioning, create a copy of that file, change the name to reflect that this is for print, and now we're going to compare those two files in Photoshop so that we're editing the print file so that it matches the digital file. Okay? One of the reasons I use Photoshop is I can put those side by side. In Lightroom, it's a little bit more complicated to do that. So create different files for your digital versus your print, because you're going to edit that print. Okay. Any questions on that and how to do that? Right. As you're going through the process, you'll have two files. You'll have the digital version and you'll have the version for printing. Once you've edited the print version, it's going to be time to size that for the print. Right? You're going to want to size that image. You may have a 45 or 60 megapixel image. That's going to print 24 inches wide by native, right? You need to pull that down to an 8.5, 11. You're going to have to resize that file. That's going to be a third version of file that you create, right? Because when you resize that, there's some things you're going to have to do. We won't get into that aspect of it today, but there we go. Okay. So I think I went backwards there, didn't I? Oh, let me show you. Okay, so when we get into Photoshop, we're going to have two files. We're going to have the digital version and the print version. And we need to soft-proof that print version. Okay, we need that print version to simulate what it's going to look like when it's printed. And so I'm going to show you this here in a moment when we go through the example, but you'll notice that when we're soft-proofing, what we're doing is we're telling the software to simulate the paper and the printer combination. That's what this device to simulate is. Okay? This Photoshop is smart enough to have a profile for that. Underneath it, we'll see relative intent. I'll walk through this with you in a live example, but we need to create this image in a way that's going to emulate that paper as much as possible. So we need to tell Photoshop what paper and printer that we're using. Again, I've got the paper choice. It's the Moab Lancel Exhibition. Rendering intent. This is something that you'll need to choose. Not to get too technical, but there's generally two types that you can select from. You may have seen this when you've printed before. You'll see relative and perceptual. They're just different ways of the software putting colors on the page. toggle back and forth between the two options and do which one looks best to you. That's as complicated as that needs to be. You'll see underneath here, black point compensation. Do not check that box. It's a trap. Don't check the box. It's a trap. If you check that box, what the software is going to do is it's going to try and solve that black problem, that black point problem for you that I mentioned a while back. It's going to take all of the dark tones and shift them up on the curve. Right? It's going to do that globally. So all of your tones are going to shift if you click on that option. Do not click that option. And then finally, we're going to click the box that says Simulate Paper Color. This is where your image will turn to looking like dog poop. When we simulate that paper color, we're telling the software that it needs to be dimmed down, it needs to be dulled out. You're going to look at that and I really don't want to check that item. But that's the prize. We need to check that. Okay. So, who's ready for a couple of examples? All right. How are we doing on time? Okay. Well, we're not going to, well, maybe we'll be if you have questions. So while I'm getting this pulled up, I'm going to try and do this without messing anything up. Any questions while I'm getting organized over here? Yes. Turned off, because the calibration devices that are on the market today are not capable of calibrating an HDR monitor. Yes, sir. Absolutely. So let's say that you send your print out. I'm just going to use a commercial printer bay photo, and they have a hand mule paper that you like, for example. You send them the image, or you send them the test image, is what I would do. I would send them those two test images, have them print them for you so you can know what it's going to look like when it comes back to you, right? You can set your expectations. They're going to have this paper printer combination, this profile, which I'll show you where you put that in to say, I'm going to use this combination because that's what that printer uses. So you're going to be emulating what they should be providing you, okay? So even if you're not printing locally at your own printer, yes, you can go through this to improve the odds that the print you receive back is what you intended, Okay. So I've got two images that I want to walk through, two examples that I want to walk through with you here, and just make sure that I can get this out of here. On the right, this image here is the digital version of the image that I captured, and after edits, this is the vision that I had. Whether you like the image or not, doesn't matter. This is what my image looked like, right? I'd gone through a number of edits and done a number of things to it after bringing it into Photoshop to get it what I want. The image on the left is the second version of this file. And you'll notice in the file name up here, I have the letters SP appended to the file. This is my soft proof image, okay? Right now, the two look pretty similar, and that's because I've done the edits, but we'll walk through them. And I'm going to show you so if you're in Photoshop and we want to set this up, we're going to come up here to View, Proof Setup, Custom. And that's going to bring up this little dialog box that we saw a moment ago. And generally, when you open this up, it's going to be set to something up here, for example, sRGB. we don't want sRGB. We want to go down through our list of installed profiles. So we can see here we have a bunch of Canon profiles for the Canon Pro 1000 and their various papers. We keep coming down here, we get to the paper of my choice, the Moab Lancel. And so I'll make that selection, and if you're noticing, the image on the left is changing a little bit when I do that. We come over here and select how we want the software to render this image. We can choose between generally relative, which is what it's at now, or if we choose perceptive, you can see how it changed a little bit. It became a little duller. Right? Did you notice that? See, the dark got a little darker. Just when you're doing this, just for that particular image, go back and forth and pick the one that looks closer to what you're trying to get to, and don't worry about it any more than that. Don't try and solve things mathematically. Right? Math isn't going to work in this instance. If we click on the black point compensation, which is again the trap, you may have noticed what it did to the image. Right? So if we, in this particular image, there's some darks, but by checking that box, you know, they kind of get dulled out. We're shifting the image. See how that shifted? When I turn that on, we're going backwards in that instance. And then we want to simulate paper color, so we can see it automatically dulls it down. And then we'll just hit OK. Okay? So we've kind of gone through that. So now we have a starting point, and we've got the image on the left, and we're comparing it to the image on the right. Right? By the way, to get things put in this 2-up situation, you come up here to Window, Arrange, and then just select 2-up vertical, and then resize the images to get pretty close. If this was a relatively dark image, and the next one that I'll show you is, if this was a relatively dark image and it had a lot of darks in it, we can click on this thing called thresholds. So are anyone familiar with thresholds in Photoshop? Okay, it's one of the different blend modes that are available to you down here. We can see this is something that Lightroom and DxO and On1, all those don't have, is we have these different blend modes. Threshold is an option down here. I call it kind of like a helper layer, if you will. And so when we click on that, what we're presented with, where's my properties at? When we click, where did it go? Well, there, okay. When we click on thresholds, we get the histogram. And if, 0 over here on the left, we can see that, right here, threshold level number 1, that's how many pure black pixels do we have in the image. And then if we move this over to the right, we can see how that comes into play over here. And if we move it all the way to the right, this is how bright are the images. So generally, if we printed that black test image and we know what the darkest dark is that our printer can make out, we can set this threshold to that level and see how many pixels in our image are below that. So if I'm printing with this Lancel paper and I know that 5 and 6 is generally the darkest separated pixels that the print is going to produce, I can come over here and set this to 6 and say, okay, how many pixels in this image are below that level that I need to be concerned about? In this instance, there are none. So I know that I don't need to adjust the black point in this image. I don't need to check that box. There's no reason to, because there are no dark pixels. Okay? My next example will show you what to do in that case. And then we get into editing the image for print. So we want to make sure that it looks as close to possible on the left. And the thing to me is, you want to look at this through your eyes. Use your eyes. Does it look good? That is the test. Not this pixel matches this pixel mathematically. Like if I hover over here and I click on one of these buttons that tells me the RGB colors for that particular pixel, they're not going to be the same in your soft proof image. Don't try and make the numbers match. make them match according to your eyes. Okay? And as an analytical person, that was one of the hurdles I had to overcome, is to get past the math. This is feeling. As much as I hate feelings, this is all about feeling. Okay? So in this instance, out of the gate, the image looks darker to me. So I may come over here and use a brightness contrast layer and I'll turn these off and we'll work up the chain. I'll turn that brightness contrast layer on to just brighten it up a bit. And I'm just talking about a bit, right? It doesn't need much. We can see up here the level went from 0 to 8 in that brightness adjustment layer. It doesn't take much. And then I say, okay, what other parts of this image need to be fixed, need to be adjusted? So the waves, right, the breaking waves, the soft-proof image looks a little dull to me compared to the digital image. So I may use another brightness contrast layer with a mask on it to try and get that piece of the image to match the digital. Right? Again, it doesn't take much. And then I may say, okay, well, what about other aspects of it? So I may need to adjust some of the clouds, right? Maybe the clouds aren't necessarily matching, so I'll turn that on to try and get it to match. And again, these are just very simple brightness contrast layers with a mask applied to them, okay? And I may be in the mask, if we look at the mask, right? I'm just creating a mask and then using a very light brush to just brush it in, right? Until it looks right with my eyes. Okay? It doesn't normally take very much. And how do I undo this? Okay. The next one is maybe I need to address the contrast in some of the clouds up here, right? You may not be able to see this, but right, just a little bit. It's just a little bit of section, right? Just adjusting the contrast in that to get it a little more refined. And then finally, in this particular image, I had a little bit of heartache with some of the colors in the image. So I would adjust the color balance in this case for this image. And ultimately, I get it to a point where, at least in my eyes, the images look pretty darn close. And when I go to print, I'm going to print the soft-proof copy, and because I've set the software up to emulate the print, when this prints, you're probably 98, 99% match when you look at it under the right lighting conditions. Again, a $20 task lamp with a daylight balance bulb from Amazon. Okay? Any questions on that piece? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, this is coming from my monitor to that device and then projected up here. It's the same image. Shouldn't be. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. This is. Thank you for pointing that out. I focused a lot on the Adobe RGB color space as opposed to sRGB. What you're referring to is if you're shooting in JPEG or you're trying to edit a JPEG image for print, the JPEG file structure does not have the capacity to be able to manipulate the image, the pixels, in a way that doesn't result in degradation. I think it's the best way I could say it. And so you want to give yourself the most room possible to work in. Again, if you're shooting in JPEG, that might be great if you just don't ever plan to print or you don't ever plan to edit. You can let your camera do the editing for you and produce a JPEG image. But if you're sincere about wanting to get the best quality of print, you want to edit a raw image. And when you pull it into Photoshop, you want to use one of the Photoshop file structures, whether it's a PSD or a TIFF file or a PSV now, which is a whole other thing, which tells you your camera's producing too many pixels. Yeah. So that's interesting, okay? You can print, ultimately, like you can turn this file here, the printer may require it to be a JPEG, but if you're using a professional print lab, they can take this TIFF. So what you would do is when you save this, you would export it out as a JPEG. You're not going to notice the difference then, right? It's final, it's done, if you will, generally speaking. To honor that, you can take this print file, create a second version of it, put it on screen, and emulate what what an sRGB file would look like. That's generally what someone like a Bay Photo would use, is an sRGB space. And you may notice that some of the colors that are presented here change. So now you got to go back through the process, right? My advice is to work with the most data possible, right? If you can get it here and you put this file and you save it as a JPEG, if you go up here and you export as JPEG, high quality, right, you'll be fine, right? Some will use Adobe RGB. The good ones will take the Adobe RGB. The good ones. I know that's vague, but I'm not sure if Bay Photo or some of the other. Again, I'm not familiar with all of them because I don't use them. And then maybe not to Bay Photo, but I know that if you go to a legitimate photo lab that's dedicated to serving enthusiast photographers as opposed to regular people that are sending photos in to get printed off their cell phone, you're going to get a much better product. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at another example, this last example. And that will kind of wrap things up here. Thank you for your patience again. All right. But this isn't the one I just opened. Ah, good. Okay. Okay, so let's walk through this image and get it ready for print. Okay, so I opened up two versions. I've got the digital print here, and then I've got the soft proof. So the first thing that I would do is I'm going to set these up vertically. So I'm going to come over here, arrange two up vertical, and then I'm going to use get these down. Get them set up here so that they are good. Okay. And on the left, I've got the soft proof version. So the first thing I'm going to do is come up here to view and set the proof setup to the paper choice that I want. And again, once you do this a few times, it's going to be very, very quick and easy. I can compare to relative versus perceptual and choose relative. I'm not going to check black point. See, Adobe tried to check the black point. They're trying to send me down this rabbit hole. And then I'm going to simulate paper color. And in this case, what do you notice off of this when you compare the two? Okay. Number one, this is a dark scene. Yes, sir. The only difference between them is the file name. Correct. That's the only difference when I first start, is I've got two versions of the file. One is the digital and one is the soft proof. And it's the soft proof that we're going to put into soft proofing mode. And that's where we're at now. Okay? Yep. Okay. So this image was at sunset, right? So we've got a dark foreground, right? And because of the dark foreground, out of the gate, I know there's going to be some issues with the contrast in those dark areas of the image. So over here, again, unfortunately, this is doing a terrible job at making the distinction. But in the foreground of this image, if you were to look at the monitor, the bottom left and the bottom right is very dull, very gray. And it's because with that profile, with that paper printer combination, it can't print those blacks. It just smashes them all together, right? And so what we need to do is we need to set the black point. In fact, I'll show you how we did the black point a moment ago to demonstrate how many of these pixels are in that area. Okay, so make sure we're working in the soft proof version, right? That's highlighted up here. And then if I come up here and let me get these turned on. So again, in this paper, again, 4 to 6 is kind of the bottom end of what that paper printer combination can separate. Any pixels below that level are going to merge together and flatten that section of the image. And we can see just how many there are. There's enough here to be a concern, right? It's going to make the print look muddy, if you will. So I know I need to adjust the black point on here, and we'll get to that in just a second. I don't test this until we've got it in soft proofing mode, until we've got that profile set, right? We have to be there. So I know that those areas are going to be a concern. When I look at the overall scene, the image on the left appears to be a little less bright, not as bright as the image on the right. I know that there are certain areas in this image on the left where the saturation, particularly in the sunset area up here on the top right, is not as saturated or contrasty as I would like it to be compared to the digital image. So when I'm looking at these, I'm trying to identify the areas that I know I want to work on out of the gate to get it about 95% there, and then we can massage it to get it to the finish line. And then when we print, when we view it under the appropriate lighting, you're going to be happy. You're going to be happy with it. So we'll start with brightening the image. That'll take care of some of those black pixels down at the bottom, but I know I still have some. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a black point for this image. I'm going to manipulate those darkest dark pixels and only those darkest dark pixels. Okay, and the way I'm going to do that is just using a curve. Okay, so you can see in this curve, I've set everything, I've pinned everything to its normal position, except for the bottom left down here. I've just lifted it ever so much so it's only affecting a few pixels, enough to make a difference, but no more than that. And then when I turn that on, it might not be noticeable up here, but it is down here. We start to see in the bottom left and the bottom right, the contrast starts to come together. The contrast starts to come together, starts to unflatten. if you will. So then let's adjust the saturation, right? So up in this top right area, I want this section up here to match. And right now it looks rather dull, from left to right. So there, we basically created using a hue saturation layer. To begin with, I just pulled the saturation up a bit, and then I applied a mask so that the mask only affects that area of the image. I didn't care about the rest of the image. It was just that area of the image. So when I turn that on, it starts to get a little closer, right? I might be able to tweak it a little more, if you will. And then the final piece here is this section here tends, in my mind, appears to be a little brighter than the digital version. So here I'm going to use a brightness contrast layer, and I'm going to adjust that so that that section here looks closer to the digital image. And again, these are subtle changes, folks. These are subtle changes, right? And it's the subtleties that get you in the end where you want to be. You want to tackle the big ones and then the little ones. And so now this image is pretty close. It's close enough for me when I print this image to have confidence that it's going to be pretty darn close. Okay? You can do the same for metal prints, by the way. Anybody print on metal, on aluminum? A couple of folks? I think they look great for contrasty scenes, right? They really can pop when you've got that out there. There's a company called HD Aluminum. I'll link to them here in a little bit. I did the same thing with them. I sent them that black point file, and I had them print me an 8.5 and 11 piece of aluminum with a bunch of black dots on it, right? So I know what that aluminum is able to separate out. And I really like that image on aluminum. Okay. So once you've got it here, again, you can pull it in and you can print it wherever you want. You can print it directly from Photoshop, or you can pull this image into Lightroom. You can print it from Lightroom. As long as you're using the soft-proof image and you don't make any changes to it, meaning you're using the right paper that you selected and the printer that you selected, you should be pretty happy with the results. Okay. Any questions before I close Photoshop? I want to wrap with one final slide. Yes, sir. Yeah, so when they send it to you, right, they're going to allow you to download it, or they'll email it to you, and it's going to come in a file. Like if you're on a Mac, you just double click on that file and it puts it where it needs to go. And so that when you open up Photoshop and you come up here to the view section, it's going to show up in this list here. It's going to put it in the right folder on your file system. I'm pretty sure it's the same with Windows. Okay. Any other questions with Photoshop? Okay. And then the last slide I want to show you, let me come back over here, are a few resources that you may find interesting to help you in this journey. If you're looking for a book that can go through some of these techniques, take it to another level, we didn't get into sharpening for print or sizing for print, but if you want to take these concepts and delve into them, there's a book by Jeff Shuey, The Digital Print. It's kind of a spin off of Ansel Adams' The Print book. And then Calibrite is one that I mentioned. BenQ is the monitors. I'm not sponsored by any of these. If you're interested in a monitor, I can't stress enough how advanced the technology is getting and resulting in pulling prices down. ASUS, which is a company known for laptops and gaming monitors, their ProArt series of monitors is on my wish list, right? Instead of spending $6,000 for Apple's top-of-the-line monitor, you can get the same thing for $1,500 today through ASUS. Are you buying me the monitor? Yeah. It's a little square device that'll sit on there, and you run the little program, and it'll create a little file that sits between you and your monitor. You can use Data Color. There's another company. In setting your monitor calibration, right, if you want to delve into that, right, there's a website, an individual, his name's Art. His YouTube channel is Art is Right. He does a lot of stuff that is technical, but he does it in a way that's not so technical. Jose Rodriguez, you may be familiar with him. He's an individual that all he does is print. I think he's got 1,000 printers in his house, it seems like. A little long-winded, but he can get if you have problems with your printer, right? If your printer's making lines or not jamming or whatever, he's a good resource for that kind of stuff. And then lastly, anybody know Greg Benz? Heard of Greg Benz with respect to luminosity masking? Greg's a great guy. He is the expert with luminosity masking. He's also the current expert with respect to today's HDR technology and how to get that image that you've worked on in your regular screen to take advantage of the technology that Apple's providing today with their HDR on their phones and their monitors. So if you want to see a real image in HDR and not the old HDR, but the real HDR, he's a great resource. So thank you so much. Took a little longer than I thought I would, but any other questions? Yes, sir. It may be possible if they're using like Adobe RGB and they have similar stuff. I mean, my MacBook looks nothing like my BenQ monitor, right? And I can't get my MacBook to look like that because it just won't dull down as much as a regular standalone monitor is. So it depends on what you're using. All right.